Hi guys, this is Creative Cuts, a channel where I build, paint and create things. In today's video I'm going to build a Kraken attacking a ship. This idea started when I was browsing in my local supermarket doing the weekly shop and came across this model kit. It sat on my shelf for many months like many other projects waiting to be started, but then the time came and I decided to tackle this beast of a build. I knew this would be an ambitious build as it involved many new techniques to me and leaping into the unknown. But for those who are familiar with this channel, know that is nothing new. If you are new here and you enjoy these kind of building videos, then you could consider subscribing to stay up to date with all the latest videos. Give the video a like to show YouTube your appreciation, and feel free to ask me questions in the comments below. I'll always try to help where possible. I've had lots of things to take care of away from the hobby, so I haven't been able to build as much as I would like, but to make up for the gap in videos, here is a bumper build for you all. I had a good look at the box and immediately realised that this was going to be quite complex. I have lots of experience putting kits together, but ship models in general are pretty difficult and will definitely test your patience. To begin, I found some wood in my studio which I could use as a base. I cut out the main body of the ship and used this to gauge the sense of how big I needed my base to be. Once again, I hear my inner voice begging me to build smaller projects, but once again I completely ignored that voice and threw myself in head first. A simple way to get a straight line to create a 90-degree angle is to use a set square. If you don't have one, then you can also easily use a handsaw. It's also longer than a set square, so if you need to make a longer line, this is perfect. I'm sure many of you will know this nifty little design feature on saws, but for those who don't know, it's a good little tip to know. Once I had my base cut out, it was time to start building the model. I won't bore you with my frustrations, but be safe in the knowledge that I followed the instructions and almost threw it out the window a couple of times. Some of the images that you were meant to follow weren't very clear, or some of the parts of the model had loads of flashing still left on from when the sprues were cast. Many of the parts didn't fit together too well either. But after many hours, to my surprise, I managed to put together something that resembled a ship. Not bad. A big part of this build involved the sequence of steps needed, and I had to often work several steps ahead to make this complex build work out. I got some steps in the wrong order, which you will see later, but that's all part of the learning process, right? I needed to paint the model to near completion first, as once I started modelling the Kraken, many of the parts would be difficult to reach with a paintbrush. If you were really keen, you could paint everything on the sprue first, like the pros do, but we all have limits and life is too short. So I coated everything with some acrylic primer through my airbrush. This gives the model a good surface for paint to adhere to. I have built a couple of ships in the past and they all seem to come with these plastic sails. Kind of cool, but they look like plastic sails. I wanted sails that were in the midst of being destroyed, so I knew I had to come up with a different solution. I decided to use wet wipes, as they had the right kind of flexibility and texture. I set these aside to dry for use later. When my primer was dry, I gave the ship a light coat of brown to set the base for the wood. You could easily do this with a brush, but in this case I wanted a quick dose of colour without worrying about accuracy at this point, so I opted to stay with my airbrush. Next I painted the main details on the ship, trying to be pretty neat here and correcting any mistakes as I go. And with my ship looking pretty smart, I decided to think about the Kraken and how the two parts of this diorama could combine. I decided I wanted the ship to sit lower in the water, so I needed to make a few small adjustments to the hull of the ship. I tried using this handy mini saw I picked up, but it didn't really work out and it was too much effort. So I grabbed my Dremel and a cutting disc and trimmed a bit here and trimmed a bit there. This took a bit of thought and imagination, but I settled on something that I was happy with and decided to commit. I took some wire that was strong yet flexible for the armature of the Kraken and scrunched some kitchen foil around this for mass. I started to loosely wrap the tentacles around the ship, trying to imagine how this would look. I used bits of blue tack to be able to move everything around as needed. This way I could play with different ideas and yet still make changes. I also decided that once I had the idea of the Kraken's tentacle being fully wrapped around the ship, squeezing it apart, this would be a cool place to add some extra detail, where the ship is literally being broken apart. A few tactical cuts with my Dremel did the trick. I also wanted the masks and the rigging to feel like they were being ripped apart by the immense strength of the Kraken. I used a blowtorch to lightly melt the plastic and pull them apart when it was soft enough. I took photos of all these tentacles in place for reference later, so I could remove them and then work on them for sculpting and then put them back. I used milliput. Basically, I had loads of it and it's relatively cheap. I knew I would need lots of it, as there is a large surface area to cover on 8 tentacles, so I mixed up small batches at a time and set about applying this to my armature. Once everything was covered but still supple, I quickly moulded them around the ship so they could harden in shape. Nothing like a bit of time pressure to make you concentrate. I added a bit of texture here and there, and I realised that at this stage that, yet again, I had made things pretty challenging for myself, and it dawned on me the immense task I was getting myself into. My brain was already hurting, thinking about sculpting all those little sucker pads at all angles. But I'm here, so might as well push on. I cut up some matchsticks into small shavings where the wood from the ship had splintered apart. I then glued these in place around the areas of damage. And so to the daunting task of sculpting the suckers on the tentacles. I used small blobs of putty and pressed them on with my finger. And while this was still pliable, I squished it with the back of a paintbrush. I needed to change to a few different sizes of paintbrush for different sized indentations. I try to follow the curve of the tentacle as they twist round the ship. I continued sculpting the Kraken, adding bits here and there, very much in the knowledge that most of this would be underwater, but it makes me happy to know that it's there. Now to begin painting the tentacles of the Kraken, I couldn't use my airbrush anymore, as I didn't want to risk overspray, so I used a brush. The same Pro Acryl primer I used before, but with more control. Little nooks and crannies to get into, but time well spent here will serve me well in the future. Everything is as good as the foundation it's built on. And with a solid coat of primer, I started to add some purple ink to the black. Onto this, I loosely added some violet by Vallejo. Basically a heavy dry brush, being quite loose with my brush strokes. Onto this I added some blue violet, again by Vallejo, which for some reason is lighter than the violet. In all truth, it's instances like this which is why I don't really pay too much attention to different paint names. I just look at the colour and use good quality paint and go from there really. I moved on to the base and gave this a deep blue mix of paint, just to give the sea a sense of depth. Another tip I can give is to sometimes take a break from one task and move on to another, so long as it kind of remains in sequence. This gives the mind a new set of challenges to focus on, and keeps things fresh, as well as working through different parts of the model also gives you the chance to have a think about other aspects of the model, rather than just focusing on one part, unpick the Rubik's Cube, so to speak. And then I moved on to the sails. I cut these to shape and began gluing them into position, trying to think about how a sail would behave and the shapes it would make if being pulled and ripped by a giant tentacle. It's funny, the things I spend my day thinking about sometimes as a model builder. Not your average train of thought, but there you go. Welcome to my world. Sometimes I had to use several parts of sail to make one big sail, as the tentacle had fully wrapped itself around the mast. A little flag came with the kit, and seeing as I'm based in the UK, I thought it would be fun to add. Carefully stuck it around the broken flagpole. Then I had a brain fart and decided to work on the shuttering for the resin to be poured into. I thought I had some acrylic sheets to hand, but no, I cobbled together a few bits of wood and glued them in place. I still had lots of painting to do, and adding the sides at this stage only made things more difficult to paint. When I spoke about getting my sequences wrong, this is where it happened. The more complex your builds get, the more the sequencing of steps becomes more important. Sure, this comes with experience, but planning ahead can sometimes be the difference between success and failure. I then wrapped all the sides with this new product that I've been trying for the first time. It's sold as resin tape or jewellery tape, and seems to stop any resins from sticking to it. Having used it for this project, I can report back that it is fantastic stuff. Very useful, and something that I will definitely experiment with more in the future. Having realised my error, I grabbed a brush and got back to painting. This time with some pink, again from Vallejo. I wanted to separate the soft inner part of the tentacle from the tougher outer skin, so I thought gradually getting lighter in tone would help this. The sails were still looking far too clean for my liking, so I began to weather them with a thin coat of watered down brown through my airbrush, just to dirty them rather than actually add colour. And while I had my airbrush out, I decided I wanted an even more pronounced jump in colour on the tentacles. I coated all the inner parts with some skin tone, Onto this, I then came in with some brighter orange. I wanted to base the orange with a lighter colour first, so it doesn't get muddy in colour. And now for a quick review. Looking good, but a little too light now. I brushed on a coat of transparent purple from Pro Acryl to fuse all the colours together. Basically a wash to add shadows to the recesses where the paint pools, and to filter the raised areas through a veil of purple. I then changed lanes and mixed up a little brown and black oil paint, and filled a small palette with some white spirit. This way I can control how thick I want my wash to be. Nothing fancy, just the same as you would do if you were using acrylic paint with water. I use oil paints for this step because the thinner has a lower surface tension than water, so it bleeds into all the little crevices and really brings out all the details in the model. I also love how the oil wash dries very matte, unlike some acrylic washes which dry to a satin, almost glossy finish. Now, with most of the painting done, I grabbed a roll of cotton thread, which came with the model kit, to try to add some rigging and guide ropes for the sails. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this, and not something I want to repeat in a hurry. I looked at the image on the front of the box and read the instructions, but to say this involved a huge amount of patience is an understatement. And with most of the building part done, it was time to mix up some resin and add this angry ocean to this model. Because the resin I had works better for more shallow pours, I poured the resin in multiple layers. Again, this meant that 4 layers waiting 48 hours drying time for each meant this process took place over the course of a week. I mixed up the resin as per instruction and then added some resin tints and ink to colour the resin. I wrote down the recipe so I could hopefully repeat the same colour for each layer. Once all the layers were poured and dry, I crossed my fingers and cracked off the supporting sides. I always have a sense of anticipation at this stage because I'm just hoping that everything dried and there were no major leaks. When the final side popped off, I let out a big sigh of relief as I could see that everything went as planned. There were a few imperfections here and there, but nothing that I couldn't fix. And whilst this ultra flat block of resin looked cool, it didn't really resemble a raging ocean. So I tried to imagine how waves could be placed. I roughed out some basic shapes with chalk into my resin. I wanted to try and carve an ocean back into it. I did this in a previous video on a much smaller scale, and it worked out really well. Link above if you want to watch that. But with this build I wanted to take that idea and run with it and really push my limits. Little did I know that this task would again take me a whole nother week, and how monotonous it was. I loaded my Dremel with a wax carving bit and slowly began grinding. Of course I used safety equipment, gloves, eye protection, a filtered spray mask. I also opened all the doors and windows to allow the airborne particles to blow away. I would grind with one hand and hoover with the other. This kept most of the dust to a minimum, but In all truth, it still got everywhere. Definitely not a clean job. Slowly, grinding away, trying to introduce a sense of movement. And so I grinded, and grinded, and grinded some more, until finally I had something that looked like an ocean. I also sanded all the edges to get rid of any imperfections, working my way up from 120 grit sandpaper to 800 wet dry paper. Nice and smooth. And now for the magic ingredient. All that grinding has really dulled the surface of the resin to a very matte finish. So I grabbed some 2K clear coat, an ultra glossy lacquer, mainly used in the motoring industry, and sprayed all the water. I wasn't too worried about any slight overspray at this stage, because a little extra wetness here and there isn't a bad thing. To match the wet look of the water, I painted all the tentacles with a polyurethane varnish. This is my go-to varnish when I need something looking really glossy and wet. Next it was time to add some drama to the ocean. I took some white ink and lightly began to paint in where I think the white water and bubbles would occur. I would build this up in layers to get a nice variation in tone. Painting this in all by hand was once again an exercise in patience, but as with any of these laborious tasks, you can only start at one end and finish at the other. Once I was happy, I loaded some teal into my airbrush, this time from golden, and gave all the white I had just painted a light coat to shift the colour towards a more blue-green colour, as if below the surface. I sealed all this with some more clear coat spray. I cut some beading and painted them with a bit of wood stain. This will become a nice border for the resin block to sit into. I also poured some resin on a silicone mat and spread this out with a wooden stick. I let this partially cure for about 8 hours, and then began to cut them into small pieces. With some UV resin and a UV light, I was able to glue these at impossible angles to create splashes as the giant sea monster burst through the ocean. And last but not least, I came in with some pure acrylic white paint to create another layer of sea foam and bubbles nearer the surface of the water. Again, slow, painstaking work, but we have come this far, so no complaints now. This project really pushed me into areas that I felt completely out of my depth, but facing those challenges and finding solutions is how we learn and progress. This was like 5 projects in one, but I'm so happy that I persisted with it because I'm thrilled with the result. Sure, there are things that I would do differently in hindsight, and I've definitely learnt loads. When I bought this kit at the supermarket, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I would end up building something like this. If you have enjoyed this video, then please feel free to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest videos. Hit the like button to show your appreciation. Thank you all for your continued amazing support, and happy building. Enjoy.